Okay, so a thing you should know about me is that I started watching Drive to Survive. I got really into F1, so I have gone like down the rabbit hole. I have exhaustively researched tire compounds and all kinds of other stuff that I never thought that I would be super interested in.
This is the Culture Study Podcast, and I'm Anne Helen Peterson.
And I'm Nicole Washington, recovering sports addict and newly minted F1 obsessive.
The reason I asked you on is because you don't hide your F1 fandom. In fact, it is a major feature of your stories. And I feel like I have gleaned things about F1 just through exposure to your stories. So before we get to your story of F1, for me, who I will say and preface that I have watched a couple of the Drive to Survive episodes during the pandemic, maybe at some point. That is about the extent of my knowledge.
I've watched all of the seasons at least 3 times.
Good. Okay. Right. So we have the bona fides in place. Can you explain Drive to Survive really quickly? Because that's my access point, and I think a lot of other people listening, that's their access point.
Sure. Drive to Survive is a series on Netflix. It has 5 seasons, I believe. Each season follows a racing season. The first couple of seasons are sort of designed around following one team over the course of the season. So and the first seasons don't have the 2 of the bigger teams, Ferrari and Mercedes. They show up a little bit later, I guess, after they decided it was worth their while. But that's the general premise, is that it's the season follows a racing season. Each episode is usually focused on one team over the course of the season, although that changes a little bit as you go through the seasons.
I will say, just as a side note, that this formula for a reality television show has become incredibly popular. And I think, the fact that F1 bought in to allowing this amount of access to their stars, unprecedented access, right? And as you point out, that has to do with ownership switching, but there's one for golf, there's one for tennis, there's one for cycling, I believe now.
Yes, my F1 group chat became obsessed with the cycling one after we moved on from F1. So, yes, our F1 group chat is the Vroom Vroom Boys, and the cycling one are the Bike Boys.
And they are, I think, remarkably effective in expanding the fan base of these somewhat niche sports interests, whatever you want to call them, and have done really well on Netflix. So that's just, people, I think, have entered in different, have started watching one and then they expand and they watch all the other ones too.
Yeah, it's general enough to give you sort of an overview of the sport and sort of how it operates, but also goes deep into a particular person or a team enough that you get a real hook.
What is F1 if someone has never heard of it?
Formula One is a car racing championship. It's that simple. You can go a step further and say that there are actually 2 championships. There is one for the people who make the cars and one for the people who drive the cars. That's it. It's really just that simple.
And we're talking about really nice, all of the luxury brands that we've heard of, those companies are making these cars.
Sort of. So it is what I believe is referred to as open wheel racing, because the actual part where they sit is open. They don't have windows, they don't have windshield wipers, they're just sort of plunked down in a car. Think of it as a very fancy version of those Little Tykes race cars. That's what we're dealing with here. Not a lot of amenities for the driver. And there are a couple of constructors. So the championship for the people who make the cars is called the Constructors' Championship. And the reason why it's called Formula One is because there is a formula to building the car. There are all kinds of rules and regulations, how far you can be off the ground, how much the car can weigh, how much the drivers can weigh, everything that you can imagine there is a regulation around. And they switch them up and make changes and stuff like that all the time to make the cars go faster, to make it more exciting, to make it, in theory, more carbon neutral, but we'll come back to that. And also just to shake things up a little bit. But yes, so there are a couple of constructors. Mercedes, Red Bull, and Ferrari are sort of the 3 big ones. They have their own teams, and then they also make components for other teams' cars. The fancy sponsors or logos that you see, the Rolex, the Tag Heuer, I'm probably mispronouncing
Yeah.
that. I'm not a watch girl. Those are actually sponsors for the team.
Got it.
And there's a whole other series of kind of lore around F1 sponsors because there's like a lot of things, a lot of corruption, a lot of weirdness. Also, a lot of sponsors that like no one really knows what they do outside of sponsor F1. So,
They're totally consultants. That's like
yes.
hedge funds, like something with group at
Yes.
the end. And then do you like compete as a team, as individuals? Does it depend, like the Olympics, on where you were born or where your citizenship is? Like, how does that all work?
So the way that the teams break down is that because F1 started in England, almost all of the teams have a presence somewhere in England, like sort of close to each other, even if they are like, say, Red Bull, which is, I didn't know this until I started watching Drive to Survive. Red Bull is an Austrian company? Who
I
knew?
knew this. I knew this. They're really big in Europe. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, Red Bull's so disgusting that I just assumed that it was American, but whatever. You know, Mercedes is a German automaker, but they also have a presence in England. So it just sort of depends. There's a team called Haas that is, in theory, the American team because it is owned by Gene Haas, who also owns a NASCAR team. And so they have a headquarters in England, but also one in Kannapolis, North Carolina. But their drivers are German and I don't remember what Kevin Magnussen's nationality is, but he's Nordic of some sort. And then their team principal is a Austrian Italian named Gunther, who also has some really great memeable moments. So it's sort of like a real big patchwork. The thing that I really love, and where I think a lot of the drama of Real Housewives of Monaco, which is what I like to call F1, is that so the Constructors' Championship is where the real money is. That's the top 10. There are 10 teams. Whoever places first gets a shit ton of money. And then it goes down the list. The Drivers' Championship, so there are 2 drivers for each team. So there are 20 drivers in the Drivers' Championship. That's like a whole separate thing. So you would think that if you are winning the Constructors' Championship, you are also winning the Drivers' Championship,
Right.
but that's not necessarily true. And sometimes you will have drivers come into conflict because the team wants to manage the race and have them do a 1-2 finish or a 2-3 finish. And let's say number 3 driver actually wants to be number 2, and so does something dumb during the race that like ends up taking both of the drivers out or causes some other issue. So they are a team,
Right.
but they're not necessarily always working as a team. And their Drive to Survive had some pretty spectacular examples of that.
Okay, so just to use my antiquated, very basic sports analogy here, it would be like Michael Jordan's the MVP. He knows he's going to be the MVP. Maybe he's already been voted as the MVP. They get to the championships and like either he sabotages Scottie Pippen in some way or Scottie Pippen sabotages him because they're in competition.
It would be like if Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen are both on the Bulls, and the Bulls are trying to win a championship, but the MVP race is still open, and so they're both fighting with each other to be the MVP.
Got it. Okay. Got it. And they would like maybe be sabotaging each other.
Yeah, there's something in F1 called team orders, which is basically when orders come down from the team that are like, hey, stay in this place or let your teammate by or something like that. And so a lot of the conflict you see is when someone doesn't listen to team orders and is like, and you get a lot of whining on the radio or like, no, I'm faster. I should get to go by, or like, no, he should let me by. And just, it's a lot of like sort of very toddler-esque drama that I love.
Okay, so let's backtrack. How did you get into F1?
I had a couple of friends who were watching it who were like, you should really watch this thing. It's funny. The 2 teammates in this episode keep taking each other out of the race. It's like if you and I were racing against each other. And I was like, I don't want to watch a bunch of white dudes, minus Lewis Hamilton and Alex Albon. Like, I don't want to watch a bunch of white dudes racing expensive cars. And it doesn't appeal to me.
And to be clear, we're talking about the Netflix series, right?
Yes, we're talking about Drive to Survive, the Netflix series. I was like, I don't know, it doesn't really, it's not curling over all the way for me. And I say that as someone who really loves sports, who gave up watching the NFL because I just morally for me I couldn't do it anymore. Also quit watching NCAA basketball, which I am contractually obligated to love being from North Carolina, during the first wave of conference realignment. So like I love sports. And I was just like, this doesn't really sound appealing to me. And I finally sat down and watched one episode and I was absolutely hooked. It like scratches all of the itches for me. It's interesting. It's fast. I love cars. I love all of the like internal drama and dynamics. And it's also very technical. So like you can go on a very deep dive about almost any topic, like from brakes to wheels to tire compounds to the history of how the tires happen to the history of the different tracks. And just like there's so many little nuances and like bits and pieces. I just think it's fascinating.
Is it like a lot of sports where you can be a casual fan, or does it like really reward intense fandom?
I think it rewards either one. Like you can be a casual fan and just like maybe watch a race to see who wins and call it that. Or you can have, not that I necessarily do this, but you could have several group chats and like subgroup chats where you are analyzing the nuances of what the drivers are wearing and whether or not their recent breakup is affecting their driving, and talking about the rumors that you see on some sort of like godforsaken deep cut F1 fan account on Instagram. You could do that if you wanted to.
So this is a good segue into my next question, because I think part of it to me, and part of the reason why the series was so effective in turning people into fans, is that they are very good celebrities as well. So who are our top, like who are the people, who are the players?
So I will say that now they are very good celebrities. Drive to Survive happened when Formula One was sold to an American company called Liberty Media. And because it's an American company, the drivers were allowed to do more on social media to like kind of be celebrities more. Before that, when it was owned by Bernie Ecclestone, there was like he put the kibosh on. Lewis Hamilton used to get penalties for like posting like pictures of him on Snapchat with like his niece and nephew on like Christmas morning.
Are you kidding?
So yeah, they have like a very strict lockdown, and they're a lot more accessible now. And that has directly coincided with Drive to Survive, which has also directly coincided with like the big jump in F1 fandom, at least in the US.
Yeah. Yeah. Basically, the drivers were celebrified by opening up their social media. And also, I mean, the decision to do Drive to Survive is part of that celebrification.
Yes.
Okay. So who's your favorite?
So the most important person that you need to know about is Lewis Hamilton, in my opinion. He is the lead driver for the Mercedes Petronas Formula One team, which is hilarious if you watch Drive to Survive because he always forgets the full name of it. He is the only black driver on the grid and one of two drivers of color on the grid, the other being Alex Albon, whose mother is Thai. He is an absolutely incredible racer, both technically, and he's also a very good celebrity in the sense that he's like very online, but not in an annoying way. So like he's online just enough to give the fans what they want.
Yeah.
He recently launched a non-alcoholic tequila and like dropped enough little breadcrumbs before the launch that like people were just frothing at the mouth to speculate and try and figure out what it was. So like he knows how to play the game. Also, his fashion sense is impeccable. He has a Rihanna-like gift for wearing things that do not seem like they should be clothing that should be put on a human body and looking incredible in it. Just like, also, he has a bulldog named Roscoe that he is obsessed with. And you know I love anyone that's obsessed with their dog.
I'm just Googling right now just to make sure that I'm... Yeah, and so he's pretty young.
He is actually, I believe, close to 40.
Oh, he's 38.
He's not the oldest, but he is one of the oldest drivers on the grid.
And he's 5'9".
They're actually almost all very short kings, because the shorter you are, the easier it is to like fold up and get into that seat.
You know what? Tall men have a lot of possibilities of other things that they can do. So this is a great opportunity. So my question is like, you don't like do F1 in college. Like there's no like, how do you get started? Like what do you do as like a teen?
Very, very young, like 7, 8 years old, doing go-kart races and working your way up from there. which is why most of the people that are in it are rich, because that's a lot of time and a lot of money. Lewis Hamilton actually did not come from a super privileged background, and he talks a lot about how his dad had like multiple jobs to try and keep him on the track, and was like doing a lot of the work on the go-kart himself just because they couldn't afford it otherwise. There are a couple of other racers like that. I think Esteban Ocon came from like a normal like middle class background, but most of them come from wealthy backgrounds. A lot of them had parents who were racers.
My memory from the few episodes of Drive to Survive that I watched was like they went to one of their like familial homes, and it was like a palace.
Yeah, that I believe is the episode with Carlos Sainz, whose dad, Carlos Sainz Sr., is a very famous, very good rally car driver. Also, I should confess that I thought I was like coming new to Formula One, but I realized as I was watching it that number one, I grew up going to the jack ship a lot, but I also used to be really into rally car racing and like my early teens. I don't know why, but I was.
Really? Why? Why were you? Why did you get into it? I have no idea.
I just thought it was really cool.
Fascinating. You know, like this is one of those things, if it's around and you're kind of bored as a teen, you get into it, right? Like I got obsessed with baseball box scores when I was a kid because I was so bored in the summer, and you could like collect them and cut them out and put them in like, I put them in like a photo album. Or I really liked going to the rodeo because there wasn't anything else going on. And so some of it is just like, oh, this is a thing. And so maybe for some people, it's like, this is what is on the TV when I'm growing up. Yeah. And then I get interested that way.
I come from a car loving and a fast car in particular loving family. So I think that also probably had something to do with it.
Totally. So I asked Culture Study readers to send in their questions about F1, and I've got a few that I want to ask you, and several of those are about just this overarching, like, why? Why are people into it? So what do you think just as like an overall? You've said a little bit about this, but I'd love to hear your grand theories.
So I made a rule pretty early on after watching Drive to Survive and starting to follow like various social media accounts and stuff that I was only going to get my F1 podcast, my news, my information, my analysis from women. And that has made a big difference for me. So there are so many great female fan focused podcasts. And not to leave anyone out, but I'm just going to focus specifically on women because I am a cisgender woman. And this is a part of sports fandom that I have always struggled with, because there is nothing a cis man loves more to be like, oh, you like this sport? Please name these 16 esoteric facts or you're not a real fan. There is none of that in this universe. There are these incredible creators like Lily Herman, who writes a really great newsletter and has incredible analysis on her Instagram stories. There's Two Girls, One Formula. There's fan behavior. So that has made... it feels really welcoming to me. Going so far as there's a place here in New Orleans where I always go to watch F1. And it's a pretty female-dominated space, the group of people that show up. And it just is like, it's very welcoming as a female sports fan in a way that I have not found any other fandom to be. So that is a big part of why I like it so much. Also, like I mentioned, I just really love all of the like weird technical aspects of it and how many teeny tiny things can shift in a race. So there are things like, you start the race with all of the fuel that your car will need for the race, which means that it's heavier at the start of the race, lighter and therefore faster towards the end. Also, as you were going around the racetrack, the tires are all leaving rubber, so the track gets grippier as you go on. And they're just all these different variables. And so I think that there's something for everyone. If you want to be really technical, you can be really technical. If you want to just like look at the Vroom Vroom boys go fast and various sort of circle shapes, fine, you could do that. If you just want to be interested in like the WAGs, they have gotten like, you know, they're very social media savvy. So it's got something for everyone.
All right. Our first take/question is from Emily.
My husband has been into F1 racing for a while, and recently I was asking him about it, why he likes it, what even is it, etc. I found it interesting to learn about because every time we discussed it, he mostly talked about drama between crews, staff, or racers. I'm not into sports, but I am into rich people gossip. So, is F1 basically just Real Housewives for cis men? Why do I love rich people gossip so much? And why is it such a cultural phenomenon?
Yes, the answer is yes. It is 100% Real Housewives of Monaco. That's what I call it. 100%.
I mean, I think about this a lot in terms of like the ways in which celebrity gossip is always feminized, but somehow sports gossip is masculinized, right? When it's about the same thing. It's oftentimes about...
There's a whole offshoot about Travis and Taylor here that I'm not even going to get into.
Right? And I think that maybe F1 gives an opportunity to map some of those more fun components onto, like, it's more seamlessly integrated into the sport. Does that make sense?
Yes.
What do you think here?
I think that is correct. And I think that part of it is that a big part of the sport is whining. It's whining on the radio. It is whining to try to play the refs to say, hey, the refs, that's not what they're called. They're called the stewards. But going to the stewards to say, hey, we got flagged for this, but this other team didn't get flagged for this, or this looks suspicious. You might want to go check. Like, there's a whole lot of tattling and like that kind of interpersonal drama and conflict is baked into actually the way that you run the team and how you're always looking for every advantage. And it's, I think, a lot more visible than it is in other sports. And so you get more access to it.
This, I think, highlights my ignorance, but how long has it been around?
I'm sure there's some dude on the internet waiting to actually me, but generally speaking, it started right after World War II because there were a bunch of abandoned air bases. And so naturally someone was like, you know what we should do? Drive some cars really fast around them. And that's how it started.
And so I wonder how much too is part, and I see this a lot in golf, which I'm more familiar with, is like how you have these structures that have been in place that have at least historically really favored people with money or access to money, or like this is something that people with money do. And then part of the narrative that I think particularly Americans like is what happens when we like new people, and whether that's people of color, that's people who didn't grow up in those incredibly high echelons of power, like enter the sport, and then that becomes a narrative. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Like this year, Logan Sargeant, who is literally a Florida man, is the first American racer on the grid, which is a way of saying he is the first American racer competing amongst the 20 drivers on the 10 teams in many, many years. And so there's been like a whole lot of talk around that, about him being an American, also about him being a rookie, how that relates to this like historically like epitome of British racing team that he is on, Williams. So yeah, I think that you are absolutely spot on with that.
So the part of the question where she says, why do I like rich people gossip so much? I mean, it's just, for me, it's the like, oh, even when they have all of their other needs met, there's still drama. Like there is always going to be drama. Petty. Yes.
I don't know how to answer that other than to say that I also enjoy rich people gossip because I really enjoy drama that does not involve me. And I think the thing with rich people is that because they have all of their other needs met, most of the time the drama is like incredibly low stakes. So like you're watching it thinking, how am I going to pay my rent? And like Kim and Courtney are arguing over who copied whose like Italian Dolce & Gabbana wedding. Like it's the absolute and utter just ridiculousness of the things that some of these folks are actually worried about compared to the grand scheme of things. And the fact that they don't, like, I worry about stupid things all the time, but I am fully aware that, like, no one cares what color the hand towels in my bathroom are except for me. Like, I know that that's a ridiculous thing to worry about. Kim and Courtney, to use an example, are out here fighting about who copied whose wedding, like, the future of the universe depends on it.
So, the analog there is the very high stakes retiree gossip on Nextdoor, which, as you point out, their other needs are met in many other ways. And so what they are doing with their spare time is they are fighting with each other. There was a huge fight last year about a woman who kept putting out food for the deer. And so they have a lot of time to think about this. And as an observer, I have to use Nextdoor because it's the place where like all the news about the island that I live on, that's where it lives. But I couldn't get enough of it. I was like, oh my gosh, that person came in and like they said this and like researching them the way that I would research celebrity.
It's like homeowners association drama.
Yes.
Also,
Yes.
I would like to point out that I am aggressively anti-deer. They're just walking disease vectors, but that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, don't feed the fucking deer. Okay. So, okay. We have a question from Megan about the world of racing and what sets F1 apart.
Thoughts on how Formula One is the cool new sport, but NASCAR is still largely seen, as far as I know, as quote-unquote white trash culture? As someone who doesn't watch either, they seem similar. Is it that Formula One has more expensive cars, that it's global, or is it about drivers and fans?
Cannot wait to hear your answer to this, Nicole.
So this is actually a really interesting question for me because, as I hope many of you know, but if you don't, NASCAR stands for the National Association of Stock Car Automotive Racing,
Yeah.
I think. But it started out as bootlegging, and it started out like in the South and the Carolinas as like you got to build a really fancy car based off of, or a really fast car out of whatever parts you have around, so that when someone discovers your moonshine still, you can get away. Like that is the
I did not
way
know
back
that.
origins. Yeah, that's the origins of NASCAR. So I actually grew up, because I was in North Carolina, like being around NASCAR a lot. My mom went to NASCAR races. I watched my friend's brother like go to drag races. So I'm not sure if I'm the best person to ask this, just because I don't think that NASCAR is white trash, because I am not white, and I and a lot of my family have been not necessarily involved in NASCAR, but in things that are sort of like related to it. So like motorcycle racing and like that kind of thing. I think the appeal of Formula One over NASCAR is that it's perceived as being fancier because it's like European, right? Like,
Right.
I took a trip to Italy this summer/fall, and I have been doing in my best like annoying girl that came back from study abroad voice, like, oh my god, the honey there was just so much better than it is here. Like that's it. It's just that it's from somewhere else, and so that makes it seem cooler than whatever it is that we have here.
Yeah.
That's a large part of it. At least that's all I can figure, because there aren't really a lot of differences. There's also a racing circuit called IndyCar that I don't know as much about, that it's kind of like partially between Formula One and NASCAR in terms of like rules and setup and stuff like that. I do want to get more into IndyCar, but I don't know if I have time in my busy F1 focused schedule.
You know, where I grew up, there was a lot of demolition derbies, which are essentially you take old cars that you've kind of made look cool, and then you smash them into each other usually at like a rodeo grounds. They're pretty great, but they also like, there's something about the whole the whole structure of the event that is meant for mischief, right? Like there's a lot going on. And, you know, I think that what I really appreciate the point that you make about how NASCAR maybe signifies to people outside of the South in particular as something that is white trash culture in quotes, but it's almost like how evangelical has become this shorthand for a certain type of politics, which completely excludes like an entire population of evangelicals, right?
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about race. So, yeah, I think that you're right. I think that the F1 thing is that it's global, and that
I don't even think it's that it's global. I think it's that it's European. Like, it is European in origin, and then while it might be global now, I think that people think of it as like, oh, this is our dumb American racing, and this is the fancy European racing. Like,
right.
I think if there's the divide, that's the way that folks are thinking of it. You were right in pointing out, however, that it is global. Like the race this weekend is in Brazil, which interestingly is basically like a home race for Lewis Hamilton. Brazil has like claimed him as their own, which is kind of cool to see.
Someone asked this question. They were like, how is that working? How is it that he's like, is he secretly Brazilian that we don't know about? Or is it just that Brazil has claimed him?
I think it's that Brazil has claimed them. I think it's probably because he's black, and it's nice to see someone who looks like the people in your country. There's also a fascinating backstory here, which is that Max Verstappen, who is the world champion and lead driver for Red Bull, is dating this woman named Kelly Piquet. Kelly Piquet's father and brother, Nelson and Nelson Jr., were both Formula One racers and also raced in some other series. They're Bolsonaro supporters. Nelson Piquet Sr. has made some vile racist comments about Lewis Hamilton that Kelly has like not really ignored or spoken on. So my Formula One group chat has done a lot of speculating about how mad the Piquet family must be that they are, and this is the important part I left out, they're all actually Brazilian, like born in Brazil. We've been talking about how mad they must be that like Lewis comes to town and everyone is just like, he's home, and just like completely ignores him.
How much of the fandom, this is a good follow-up question, has developed since the Netflix series? And is there a divide in the fandom of like, oh, well, I was a fan before Drive to Survive?
Yes, there is. It breaks down a lot along gender lines, a lot along like some of the drivers have even made comments about how the upswing in fandom, particularly in female fandom, is just because they want to look at the hot guys and they don't care about anything else. Also, hilariously, in my opinion, the driver that said this is not one of the most attractive on the grid, if we're really going to start talking about things like that. So, like, I don't know what you mean, sir. So, yes, there is a divide. There is always a divide in sports because we've touched on gendered sports fandom and how dumb it is. But there's been a lot of talk around what F1 is going to do with this upswing in American fandom because they tend to see other non-American like leagues and teams and sports tend to see the US as a cash cow because they can make a lot of money here. And there's some talk about this in the context of the race schedule. So there, for a while, was one F1 race in the US. It's held in Austin at Circuit of the Americas, which is a purpose-built track. It is built for racing. They added a second one that they run in Miami, which has a reputation for being like a place to see and be seen and not really being for like actual fans. And this year, in a couple of weeks, they will be running a race in Vegas that actually goes down the Vegas Strip and has caused all kinds of drama in Las Vegas. There is no place to watch the race for free, even though they will be going down the strip. They're putting up barriers so that you can't actually see if you're just walking along. Like, you have to pay to watch the race. There's nowhere really to catch a glimpse of it otherwise. The people in the city of Las Vegas are pissed about this because there essentially would be like if a race was happening on your street and all of a sudden they blocked it off and were like, hey, you got to pay us $150 to look outside your window and see anything.
Right.
It's made like a traffic nightmare. It's been a construction nightmare. I've actually seen a little bit of it because I have family in Vegas, so I've been there twice this year. But it's a money grab because the tickets are expensive. The packages, you can imagine, like being in Vegas with the big hotels, are expensive. Yeah. So it makes F1 a lot of money. And so there's a real tension between trying to actually cultivate an American fan base that like is very online and loves memes, love merch, like that kind of thing, and just using it as like a cash grab.
Okay, so next question is from Hannah, and it's about the ethics of being an F1 fan. So I'm, again, excited to hear your response.
This is an F1 question, but also a question about ethical consumption as a fan in general. I've been a longtime fangirl of many things, one of them being Formula One. It has brought me so many lovely things, including a community. Cheering while rich dudes drive in circles really does bring me joy. But there are some times when I grapple with being a fan of a sport with mixed morals, to put it lightly, racing in places with dubious human rights records, impact on the climate, etc. I was wondering if there is a civic duty aspect of being a fan, or should there be? And how can we wield nuance as fans of the things we love?
Oh, it's just like asking about how to be a person in the world. What is your answer to this one?
I have a lot of thoughts on this as someone who gave up her two favorite sports fandoms, the NFL and NCAA basketball, over what I felt were moral grounds. You can quibble on conference realignment, but that was just a money grab, so I feel like it was kind of immoral. And then we can talk about college athletes and all the money and blah, blah, blah. Anyways, cheering for a bunch of mostly white rich dudes to win a race that is using up countless resources, does that feel great? No. But without being too dismissive, like, all of our faves are problematic, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I feel very strongly that you got to get your joy where you can find it. And there are ways to be an ethical fan. It's funny that you should get this question. There's actually a driver who is no longer on the grid, world champion, very famous, Sebastian Vettel, who quit and retired from F1 last year in part because of the environmental concerns he had about it. He stopped doing like private jets. He would always like bike to races, stuff like that. And was actually, along with Lewis Hamilton, sort of two of the most vocally progressive drivers in the sport. And F1 has made some commitments towards being more sustainable, but I don't think it's any more immoral than watching any other sport, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can argue about the place that sport in general deserves in our lives, but you could be doing something else, something more productive for humanity, arguably, with those resources. But so what? Like, we need sports, we need play, we need those sorts of things. And so, I don't know. I think that by being conscious of how sort of weird it is in fields, you're already a step ahead of most people. And I think just sort of like do what you can. Like, for instance, there are a lot of great creators on Etsy and other places who make really cool merch. That is not like officially F1 sanctioned. Also, most of the official merch is not that great anyway. So like, if you want to buy something, buy from them. Like, support your local coffee shop when they're showing the races or ask them to do it there. Like, there are ways to sort of nibble around the edges, but like,
Well, and I don't
know.
think that like condemning F1 is going to condemn car culture in the United States. Do you know what I mean?
No.
Like,
No.
it's one of those things that's similar to, oh, you should be being incredibly mindful about sorting your recycling and like rinse closely every single item because that is the only way that you prevent climate change. Right? It puts the impetus for change solely on the individual, right? And on the power of your individual fandom. I do think, I agree with you. I don't watch football anymore either because I also reached a point where I was like, there's something fucked up about the way that we are incentivizing
Yeah,
this
I couldn't
pipeline.
cheer for the hits over the middle anymore.
Right,
I got to a point where I was like, "Oh, you're not going to remember your kids in 5 years because of that." Like,
Yeah.
I can't watch this.
Or even the tension for me that's difficult is like, I want to watch football, but I would never let my kid play football.
Mm-hmm.
What does that say? Whereas I think that most people watching F1 would be like, I mean, if I had $1 billion and could get my kids started doing this driving, that'd be
Listen,
kind of cool.
I've often thought, like, maybe is it too late for a career for me? Yeah, okay, I got to get one of my friends' kids into it. Like, I'll bankroll them. It's fine.
One of your
I mean,
child
it
army.
is also a dangerous sport, just
Yes.
to be clear. No one
Yes.
has died in a Formula One race, but there are sort of lower levels like Formula 2 and 3, and people have died in those races. There have been some really serious injuries. I mean, these cars are going, 200 miles an hour around like a very flippy racetrack. Like, it is still a dangerous sport, absolutely. Also, it makes me mad that people who say that they're not athletes, because to be able to drive a car at that speed, just the like actual physical forces that you are subjected to, like,
Right. It's very similar in a lot of ways to golf in so much as you are using your musculature and your reflexes and your mental game. And so we can think of that as a sport. So, and also all of those fights, like, what is it for? Why does it matter?
Yeah.
What are the stakes?
Yeah.
If we're talking about skill, yes, there is absolutely skill there. All right, so we have a couple of questions now that I'm going to be honest, I don't even know if I know exactly what they mean. So can you translate them for me and then tell me what you think? So this first one is from Camille.
I've been following Formula One since getting hooked with Drive to Survive. My favorite driver is Lando Norris. But putting more thought into it, and it starts to feel gross. Is the FIA corrupt? Why were Hamilton and Leclerc disqualified after the race in Austin? A part on the underside of the car was out of specification tolerances? Help me understand the nuances.
Help me understand the nuances. Help me understand the nuances.
All right. Yes, the FIA is corrupt in the same way that every major governing body of sports is corrupt. That goes without saying. I think it is. It's what happens when you give a bunch of people, mostly men, a lot of power to regulate something that makes a whole lot of money.
Yeah.
So, yes, is my answer to that question.
Okay.
Why were Lewis and Charles disqualified? So this goes into the technical aspects of F1, but like I mentioned before, there is a formula and there are very specific regulations for every single part of the car. My understanding is that they were disqualified because there is like a plate on the car that scrapes along the bottom of the racetrack. And if it wears too thin, you can get disqualified. Because if it wears too thin, that means your car is sitting too low, which means you have an unfair advantage in being able to grip the track and stay on it better than the other cars.
Got it.
That's
so it's like
my understanding.
It's like an indicator that something in your formula is off.
It is an indicator, yes, that something in your formula is off, and whether that is intentional or not is a whole separate thing. I think a lot of the drama around that particular disqualification was that the FIA does random, I'm using air quotes here, spot checks, and they just happen to check those two cars, and so there's some like conspiracy theories about that.
What are the conspiracy theories?
I just like, because so there's a whole lot of stuff between Max, who is racing for Red Bull. Red Bull has seen a lot of dominance following a period of Lewis and Mercedes dominating. Charles Leclerc races for Ferrari, which is the other of like the big three teams. So there's just, it's also, I should have mentioned this earlier, the conspiracy theories in Formula One are both wackadoodle and also accurate in a way that is really entertaining. There was a whole conspiracy theory about Ferrari cheating that actually turned out to be true, that involved tangentially Lewis and another. Yes, there's a lot of great lore, as one of my cousins who is into now Formula One, thanks to me, calls it. There's just so much backstory behind everything.
I mean, the great thing about conspiracy theories is that for a lot of things that, as you say, are controlled by men and make a lot of money, there is conspiracy going on, right? Like they are conspiring to do things.
Absolutely.
And so when you come up with theories of a conspiracy, some of them are off, but some of them are probably on, right? There is conspiring happening in the background.
Yes.
All right. This next person wants to remain anonymous, so Melody's going to read their question.
Was the controversy at the end of the 2021 season and the fight for the championship due to simple human error? Was it to maximize drama? Was it just to have a new champion because Hamilton's domination was getting boring? A win would have Hamilton, the first and so far only black F1 driver, surpassing Schumacher for most World Drivers' Championships. Did racism play a part in the decision, and why does nobody seem to even be asking that?
Okay, so back up here. What is the controversy at the end of the 2021 season?
Oh, man. This is where I put on my tinfoil hat because I have some theories about this.
Yes,
the controversy at the end of the 2021 season is that the championship came down to Max and Lewis in a race in Abu Dhabi. And because I'm extremely oversimplifying this, but it came down between Max and Lewis in Abu Dhabi. Whoever won was going to win the world championship, the drivers' world championship. And because of a decision made by one of the stewards, who were like the referees, that not necessarily favored Max, but definitely disadvantaged Lewis, Max won the championship. That is a extremely simplified version of it. People have been fighting about it basically since it happened. I am in the Team Lewis camp. I think it was absolute horseshit. The steward that made the call, I'm not laughing that he got death threats, but he got like death threats, stuff like that. There's a very well-known part of Drive to Survive where Toto Wolff, the incredibly attractive team principal for Mercedes, yells in his like Austrian accent, no, Michael, that is not right. That has become like a meme in the F1 world.
Yeah.
That's what I was laughing about. But I actually don't think that racism played a part in it. I can't believe that I am saying that because it almost always does. I also don't think it was human error, though. I think that, I am speculating wildly. This is me and my tinfoil hat right now.
Yeah.
I think that it was not human error. I think that Michael wanted to make something happen, whether that was for Red Bull to win or for Lewis to lose or just to make something exciting happen. I think that he made a call in order to do that, and it kind of backfired, I think. That is my personal belief. You can find speculation about every single part of this race, about every single part of the call, about, it's like that meme, the guy with like the red strings everywhere, about how like Michael Massey, who is the steward that made the call, relates to Lewis and to Toto but yeah, it's, I think it was a bullshit call, and it was a bullshit call that essentially threw a race and made a huge, huge difference. I think that, I mean, maybe it is racism that folks didn't want to see Lewis Hamilton break Michael Schumacher's record. Michael Schumacher is a very, very, very famous race car driver. He has been, we think, in a coma for many years now. His son, Mick, is actually a reserve driver for Mercedes for Lewis Hamilton's team. Maybe it was racism. Maybe it was just not wanting that record to be broken, period. Yeah, it's... Speaking of all the rich texts in Formula One, that one race, like, someone is going to write a book about it, and I'm going to buy it and read it over and over again.
What are your favorite places, besides your group chats, for F1 gossip, speculation, conversation, discourse?
I really love Reddit. I don't ever post, but I do like to read.
Yep.
I love podcasts. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and that is where I get a lot of my information, speculation, stuff like that. I'm going to run down a list of my favorites. Again, noting that I try really hard to only get my Formula One information from women, just because I like how welcoming that fandom is. So there's Fan Behavior, which is a Formula One podcast. There's 4F1R, get it? Yeah. For the Girls, which is a Formula One podcast. And if I remember correctly, they have a pretty active Discord where you can find a lot of really cool information. There's Two Girls, One Formula. There is DRS, the Donut Racing Show. And then there is also Lily Herman's podcast, which I think is only for like Patreon subscribers, called Spare Parts, but it is fantastic. One of my friends turned me on to her. I think we might have talked about this before. I'm an avid romance reader, and Lily lives at the intersection of like pop culture, romance, Formula One, and many other things. So her Instagram stories are brilliant. They're perfect. She always gives a lot of recommendations and has some really great analysis. So I follow her, and we spend a lot of time dissecting her Instagram posts in my various group chats.
Where's the joy for you?
The fast cars, really. Like, it's just, I have been accused of being a fast driver, which I am. In another life, I absolutely would have loved to have been some sort of race car driver. So, like, the adrenaline rush that I get from just, like, watching it and thinking about what it must feel like to, like, drive around all these corners and these curves and, like, all the things that you have to do to, like, I take a lot of road trips, and I'm like, God, how exhausting would it be to have to drive around the same circuit at 200 plus miles an hour with all of these other people who are actively trying to get in front of you or like maybe push you up, like, so that's yeah, I think it is absolutely fascinating. Like, there are just so many little things. Like, the wind can shift in a different direction, and that can totally change the race. It's wild to me. Like, football is kind of like a game of chance.
Yeah.
But it also is sort of like, if you know who is lining up against who, you can kind of figure out what will happen. In almost every race, there is something just totally unaccounted for that, like, makes something crazy happen.
Do you think that Drive to Survive is the best entry point if someone wants to get into it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
100%.
I thought so.
It's a very low stakes entry point, and it's a very entertaining one.
And for our last question, I want to know what your most unpopular opinion is about F1.
I mean, it's not as unpopular as it was, but when I first started saying it, it was unpopular, and that is that Carlos is a better driver than Charles. He deserves to be the lead driver.
I'm going to pretend like I know everything that you just said. I'm just nodding. Like, yeah, that's great.
So the F1 fans know what I mean.
Exactly. this has been a total pleasure. I feel like I actually understand some things now.
And what I need you to do is to start rewatching Drive to Survive, and then I need you to text me, and I will talk you through every episode.
I would like it.
I'm ready for all of your Melody. You just text me. I'm ready to answer all of the questions and go into exhaustive detail about things that you do not actually want to know that much about.
Because I watched the golf one with my partner who's a golfer, and he is the little the little bird being like, and this guy is a douche, and he's about to go do this, and this guy actually is shit. So that to me is compelling.
There are two incredibly important plot lines that are just left out of the last season of Drive to Survive entirely.
Why?
I don't know.
Wait,
they didn't want that drama out in the air?
You watch the season, you watch all the little races, and then you watch the Netflix series that comes out that recaps the whole season?
Yes,
that you already
that is exactly
watched.
What I do. So, last season, this is a 2023 season, so the 2022 season was the first time I started watching the actual races.
Yeah.
And I only watched about half of the season. This season will be the first one that I have watched all of the races all the way through. But because I am a maniac, I also bought myself a subscription to F1 TV. So I've been going back, and I think I started in 2017 for some arbitrary reason, and I've been watching all of the races. Because I'm a maniac.
And so then you have to sit through the show and be like, why did they leave this out? Because you also watch it happen in real time.
It's like me watching the Britney documentary, the 8-part documentary, and be like, how do they not talk about this, right? This particular narrative that was happening because I lived through it.
If I'm going to be interested in something, I'm going to hyperfixate. Otherwise, what's the point?
Okay, if people want to know more about your F1 opinions, where can they find you on the internet?
They can find me on the internet. I quit the platform formerly known as Twitter because it's just kind of a cesspool. So the best place to find me and my F1 opinions on the internet is probably on Instagram, and I am in Nola.
All right, it sounds like we've reached the end of our dog's tolerance for us recording on a Friday afternoon. Nicole, thank you so much for joining me. And listeners, if you're a paid subscriber, stick around for advice time because Melody and I are going to answer a question about a sticky friendship situation. Thanks for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We have so many great episodes in the works, and I promise you don't want to miss any of them. If you want to suggest a topic, ask a question about the culture that surrounds you, or submit a question for our subscriber-only Advice Time segment, check the show notes for a link to our Substack. If you want to support the show and get all of the bonus content, head to culturestudypod.substack.com. It's $5 a month or $50 a year, and you'll get ad-free episodes, an exclusive Advice Time segment, weekly discussion threads for each episode, and a link to a special Google form so that your questions go to the front of the line. And the knowledge that you're making this show sustainable. The Culture Study Podcast is produced by me, Anne-Helen Peterson, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear. You can find me on Instagram at Anne-Helen Peterson and the show at Culture Study Pod. Thanks again for listening, and we'll talk again soon.